At my son's wedding, my wife was slumped on a long bench in the waiting room. Her hands trembled slightly from exhaustion. For the past 6 months, she had carried almost the entire weight of this wedding on her shoulders. I was standing out in the hallway when I heard my daughter-in-law lean down and whisper into her ear, "You deserve this. Your time is over." For a moment, I thought I had heard it wrong, but then she continued, slowly, almost calmly, "After today, the beach house should be handed over too." And right then, I understood something that chilled me to the bone. This wedding had never been about love. Before I continue this story, tell me where you're listening from in the comments. I read them very carefully. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, go ahead and subscribe to the channel now. But for now, let me tell you what really happened that day. The hallway behind the reception hall was almost empty. Music from the ballroom drifted out in soft waves, distant, muted, like a party happening in another world. I stood still for a few seconds after hearing Olivia speak, not because I didn't understand, but because I needed to be certain I hadn't heard it wrong. But I had heard it very clearly. I stepped into the waiting room. Olivia was already standing straight again, adjusting the shoulder of her wedding dress, as if she had just finished some small, ordinary task. When she saw me, she gave a polite smile, the kind of smile I'd seen many times at her family's political events. "Mr. Henry," she said gently, "people are looking for you. The toast is about to start." I didn't answer right away. I just looked over at Carol. My wife was still sitting on the long bench. She had already changed into the third dress of the day, but a few creases still showed in the fabric, as if she hadn't had a real moment to sit down and rest. Her silver hair was tied neatly behind her head, a little loose from the afternoon wind that had swept across the estate grounds. Her face looked pale, but when she saw me, she still tried to smile. "I'm just a little tired," she said softly. I knew that sentence. In 45 years of marriage, Carol only used it when she didn't want me to worry. Olivia glanced at us one more time, then stepped out of the room. The sound of her high heels faded down the stone hallway. The room grew quiet. I sat down beside my wife. "How long have you been resting?" I asked. Carol paused for a moment, as if trying to remember. "Maybe 10 minutes. I looked at my watch. 10 minutes of rest. In a day that had started at 6 in the morning, I thought back to earlier that day. Carol had arrived at the estate while the staff were still setting up tables. Olivia had said the event planner needed a few personal family touches. Somehow, those small touches had turned into dozens of little tasks. Arranging the flowers, checking the menu, showing the staff where each guest's name card should go. By noon, Carol had been moving across the estate like a house manager. I had asked Olivia twice if we should hire extra help. She had simply smiled. "Aunt Carol is doing wonderfully," she said. "And besides, it's more meaningful when the family prepares things themselves." At the time, I didn't think much about it. Carol and I had already agreed to help Mark with the wedding, partly because he was our only son, and partly because I believed that was what parents were supposed to do. 6 months earlier, when Mark told us he wanted to marry Olivia Bates, I had seen the look in Carol's eyes. She was a little surprised, but she still nodded. The Bates family had a reputation in Savannah. Olivia's father had once run for a position in the state government. Her mother was often seen at charity fundraisers. They spoke smoothly and always appeared perfectly proper. But there was one thing that had bothered me from the beginning. Almost every conversation with them seemed to circle back to one topic: assets. The first time we met for dinner, Mr. Bates asked several questions about the design consulting company Carol and I had built over 30 years. "Have you already transferred management to Mark?" he asked, his voice very calm. I told him we were gradually doing so. Then came questions about our beach house on Tybee Island, and after that, the estate where the wedding was being held today. Each question came with a polite smile, but they appeared far too often to be simple coincidence. A few months ago, one evening, I told Carol about the feeling I had. She simply placed her hand on mine. "Mark loves her," she said quietly. "Maybe we should trust that." I nodded. Because sometimes, after you've spent most of your life being a parent, you learn when to step back and let your children make their own choices. During the 6 months of wedding preparations, Carol and I had spent close to $500,000. Part of it for this venue, part for the band, the menu, and the many details Olivia called social standards. On top of that, I had officially handed the company's leadership over to Mark. At the time, it felt like a natural step. At 74, a man begins to think more seriously about rest. But as I looked at Carol sitting there, exhausted on that bench in the quiet room, I started to wonder if I had moved too quickly. "Did you hear anything?" Olivia said. I asked gently. Carol stayed silent for a few seconds. Then she shook her head. "Maybe the girl is just stressed from the wedding," she said softly. Her answer didn't surprise me. Carol had always tried to see things from the gentler side. I stood and walked over to the window. Outside, the autumn wind moved through the old oak trees across the estate grounds. Down below, guests were beginning to gather near the dinner area. Laughter floated up, along with the sound of glasses clinking together. A beautiful wedding, a new family about to begin. At least, that was what everyone believed. But in my mind, Olivia's words still echoed clearly. After today, the beach house should be handed over too. I didn't say anything to Carol, but for the first time in months, a question began forming in my mind. Had we really spent the last 6 months preparing for a wedding? Or had we been slowly walking, step by step, into a carefully arranged trap? I stood by the window a little longer, before turning back to Carol. "Rest a bit more," I said. "The toast probably won't start for a few minutes." Carol nodded, but I knew she wouldn't rest long. She had never been the type to let others do the work, especially on days when she believed the family needed to appear proper and composed. I left the waiting room and stepped into the hallway. Light from the reception hall stretched across the stone floor. Soft jazz music drifted through the air, steady and calm, as if everything inside this building was working hard to maintain a perfect sense of peace. But in my mind, Olivia's words kept repeating. After today, the beach house should be handed over too. I walked slowly toward the groom's dressing room. The door was slightly open. A light was on inside. Mark stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie. My son is 43 this year, a little taller than me. His hair has begun to show a few strands of gray, just like mine. When he was a boy, Mark used to sit in my office for hours, sketching imaginary houses on scrap paper. For many years, I believed that one day he would take over the family design firm, with the same passion I once had. When I stepped into the room, Mark turned around. "Dad," he said, "where have you been? Everyone's looking for you. They're getting ready for the toast." I closed the door behind me. "I was in the waiting room with your mom," I said. Mark nodded, but his eyes quickly returned to the mirror. "You know Mom," he said. "She likes to take on everything." I stood there for a few seconds. "Mark," I said slowly, "do you know what time your mother started working today?" He shrugged lightly. "Probably early," he said. "But Olivia said she wanted to help." I looked at my son. I searched his face, hoping to see a trace of the boy who once ran beside me in the backyard, asking endless questions about the houses I designed. But the man standing in front of me now felt more distant than I expected. "I heard Olivia talking to your mother," I said. Mark stopped moving. He turned fully toward me. "What did she say?" I repeated the words, almost exactly as I had heard them. No more, no less. When I finished, Mark stayed quiet for a few seconds. I waited for a reaction, an explanation. At the very least, some discomfort at hearing his wife speak that way to his mother. But instead, he sighed. "Dad," Mark said, "Olivia is just thinking about the future." I said nothing. He continued, "Honestly, you should start thinking about that too. Thinking about what I asked. Passing things down to the next generation," he said. "The company, this estate, and the beach house." Suddenly the room felt smaller. "You're talking as if all of that already belongs to you," I said. Mark frowned slightly, as if I had said something overly sensitive. "You already transferred management of the company to me," he said. "And we talked about letting me manage the estate after the wedding." "Manage," I repeated. "Not own." Mark looked at me for a moment, then gave a small laugh. "You've always been very precise about things, Dad." I didn't laugh. "There's something else," I said. Mark crossed his arms, waiting. "Your mother's medical savings account," I said. "I checked it last week. It's almost empty." Mark didn't answer immediately. He turned back to the mirror, adjusting the cuff of his shirt, as if my question were just another small detail in a busy day. "I used some of it," he said at last. "Some," I asked, "to buy Olivia a wedding gift. My throat suddenly felt dry. You used the money for your mother's heart treatment. To buy a wedding gift. Mark turned toward me again, a little irritated. Dad, you're overreacting, he said. I'll replace it later. Olivia deserves a proper gift on her wedding day. And your mother, Mark, stayed silent. Then he said something I would remember for a very long time. Dad, Mom tends to get a little confused when there's too much going on. Olivia just wants everything to look perfect in front of the guests. I looked at my son, and I realized he truly believed what he had just said. Not because he was cruel, but because, in his mind, the priorities had shifted. Reputation, image, the very things Olivia had talked about for the past 6 months. You should go ahead and sign the papers transferring the estate, Mark added. After that, you and Mom can finally rest. There are some very nice retirement communities near Charleston. I listened to that sentence in silence. 43 years ago, I carried this boy out of the hospital in my arms. Today, he was advising me to leave the very home I had spent my life building. I didn't say anything else. I simply nodded. All right, I said. Mark seemed relieved. He turned back to the mirror, adjusting his tie one last time, as if our conversation had only been a small step before walking onto the main stage of the evening. When I opened the dressing room door to leave, the music from the reception hall poured back into the hallway. The guests were waiting for the toast. A perfect wedding. But as I walked slowly down the corridor, I understood something had changed. Before, I thought my family was being taken advantage of. Now, I knew something else, for certain. Olivia wasn't the only one standing inside that plan. My son was standing right beside her. I didn't return to the reception hall right away. Instead, I walked back to the waiting room where Carol had been resting. The hallway was a little busier now. A few servers passed by carrying trays of wine, all of them moving quickly as the dinner reception prepared to begin. When I opened the door, Carol was still in the same place, but she stood up the moment she saw me. Is it time? She asked. I shook my head. Not yet, I said, but we won't be staying long. Carol looked at me slightly surprised. What do you mean? I walked over and placed my hand gently on her shoulder. I kept my voice as calm as I could. You need to rest, I said. We're going home early. Carol glanced toward the window where the garden lights were slowly coming on. Guests were already gathering outside on the lawn. But Mark, she said softly. I knew exactly what she was thinking. A mother rarely wants to leave her son's wedding. I'll talk to him later, I said. Carol looked at me for a few seconds, then finally nodded. She didn't ask anything else. Throughout our marriage, Carol had always had a quiet gift. She knew when to trust my decisions without needing long explanations. We left through the side path behind the estate. The autumn wind moved through the oak trees, carrying the scent of damp grass and dry leaves. In the distance, I could still hear the music and laughter from the party that had just begun. When our car rolled through the gate, Carol leaned her head back against the seat. You've been very quiet tonight, she said. I drove for a while before answering. There are a few things I need to check, I said. Carol turned to look at me, but she didn't ask for details. Instead, she simply placed her hand over mine for a moment, then closed her eyes to rest. That night, after bringing Carol home, I sat alone in my study. The room looks out over the back garden. Architectural drawings from the years I ran the company still hang on the walls. The desk lamp cast a soft circle of light across the wooden surface, where my laptop sat open. There are moments in life when a man has to decide how he will respond, when things begin to drift off their proper course. I've lived long enough to know that rushing into anger rarely helps. So, I didn't call Mark, and I didn't call Olivia. Instead, I opened my contact list and searched for a name I hadn't spoken to in many years. Daniel Brooks. Daniel had once been a client of our firm more than a decade ago. Later, we became friends. He worked in private financial investigations, the sort of work people only seek out when something feels wrong. I called him around 11 that night. The phone rang 3 times before he answered. Henry, he said. It's been a long time. It has, I replied. After a few brief greetings, I got straight to the point. I need you to look into a few things about the Bates family. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Something happened, I'm not sure yet, I said. But I'd like to be. Daniel didn't ask many questions. That was one of the reasons I called him. Give me 2 days, he said. 2 days later, Daniel came to my house in the afternoon. He placed a thin briefcase on the desk in my study. Inside were several printed folders and a small USB drive. The Bates family looks very respectable in the newspapers, Daniel said as he sat down across from me. But their financial records aren't nearly as tidy. He opened the first folder. I saw pages filled with records of loans, mortgages, and several debts connected to one of Mr. Bates's past political campaigns. He spent far more money than he raised, Daniel said. A lot more. How much? I asked. Daniel turned a page. Just under $4 million, still unpaid. I leaned back in my chair. That number explained quite a few things. The constant questions about my family's assets, the unusual interest in the estate, and the beach house. Daniel placed the USB drive on the desk. There's something else, he said. What is it, Olivia? He plugged the USB into my laptop. A video appeared on the screen. The angle was slightly tilted, like it had been recorded from a camera mounted near the ceiling. I recognized the room immediately. The living room of the estate. Years ago, I had installed a security camera system there to protect the property when we were away. In the video, Olivia stood near the window, talking on the phone. Her voice was clear. I told you, she said. Once everything is finalized, Mark will sign the papers transferring management of the estate. After that, we'll have enough assets to settle the debt. A man's voice answered from the other side of the call. I couldn't hear every word, but one sentence caught my attention. What about the baby? Olivia let out a small laugh. Don't worry, she said. Mark doesn't know anything. Once this is done, I'll find a way to leave the marriage. The video stopped. My study fell completely silent. Daniel looked at me. I thought you should know, he said. I nodded slowly. Outside the window, the night wind moved through the garden. For many years, I had believed the most important thing in a family was trust. But looking at what I had just seen on that screen, I understood something else. Sometimes, silence and patience are what allow the truth to reveal itself. And this time, the truth was bigger than I had expected. I didn't say anything right after the video ended. Daniel sat across from me, patiently waiting. In his line of work, silence is often the most important part of a conversation. I looked at the laptop screen one more time. Olivia's image in the living room of the estate was still clear in my mind, her calm voice echoing in my ears. Once everything is finalized. That sentence suddenly made the past 6 months much easier to understand. The questions about assets, the casual suggestions about transferring property, the unusual interest in the beach house. I closed the laptop. Thank you, I said to Daniel. He nodded. What are you planning to do next? I thought for a few seconds. The wedding isn't over yet, I said. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. You mean, I think I said slowly, everyone at that party should know what they're really celebrating. Daniel didn't say anything else. He simply gathered the documents back into his briefcase. If you need anything else, he said before leaving, call me. When the door closed, my study became quiet again. I sat there alone for quite a while, not deciding whether I should do something. That had already become clear the moment I left Mark's dressing room on the wedding day. What I was considering was the best way to do it. A large wedding in Savannah is never just a family event. It's also a social performance. Friends, business partners, old neighbors, people you've known for years. They were all there. If there was a place where the truth should be spoken clearly, it was there. The next evening I returned to the estate. The post-wedding reception was still underway. Hundreds of guests stood, scattered across the garden, beneath strings of warm yellow lights hanging between the old oak trees. Soft music, the sound of glasses touching, polite conversations drifting through the air. Mark and Olivia stood near the small stage at the far end of the garden. Olivia was wearing another white dress, simpler than the wedding gown from the day before, but still striking in the crowd. When I walked in, a few familiar faces turned and greeted me. I nodded politely. Mark spotted me a few minutes later. He walked quickly toward me. Dad, he said, a little surprised. You left early yesterday. Everyone was asking about you. Your mom needed to rest, I said. Mark looked around. Where is Mom? At home. He seemed slightly confused, but before he could ask anything else, Olivia walked over. Henry, she said with a perfectly polite smile. We were worried about Carol. Is she feeling better? She is, I replied. Olivia nodded gently as if acknowledging good news. We're about to start the thank you speeches, she said. You should stand near the stage. I was planning to speak as well, I said. Mark frowned slightly. Dad, You already spoke yesterday. I know, I replied. Olivia smiled again, though her eyes studied me a little more carefully than before. Well, that's wonderful, she said. Everyone will love that. A few minutes later, the guests began gathering around the stage. Mr. Bates stepped up first. He said a few words about the union of two respected families and the promising future of the next generation. People applauded politely. Then Mark and Olivia stepped up together. Mark spoke first. His speech was short. He thanked friends and family for traveling to Savannah to celebrate. Then Olivia spoke. Her voice was soft, carefully practiced. Family, she said, is not only where we come from, it is where we build our future together. More applause. When Olivia stepped down, Mark leaned toward me. Dad, he whispered, your turn. I walked up to the stage. The lights shone directly into my eyes for a moment. I looked out at the crowd. Many familiar faces were waiting, expecting a simple speech of blessing. I held the microphone. Thank you all for being here, I began. My voice sounded calmer than I expected. Carol and I have lived in Savannah for more than 40 years. During that time, we've always believed that family is the most important thing. I paused for a moment, but sometimes I continued, the most important thing in a family is the truth. A few people in the crowd began glancing at one another. I turned toward the large screen that had been set up for wedding photos. Before I give Mark and Olivia their wedding gift, I said, I'd like to share a short video. A technician looked at me hesitantly. I've already prepared it, I told him. A few seconds later, the screen behind me lit up. The video began. The estate's living room appeared. Olivia stood near the window, holding her phone. Her voice echoed clearly through the quiet garden. I told you. Once everything is finalized, Mark will sign the papers transferring management of the estate. No one spoke. The video continued. Then we'll have enough assets to settle the debt. I didn't need to look at Mark to know he was standing frozen below the stage. When the video ended, I turned back to the microphone. I'm an architect, I said. I've spent my life building homes for other people, but I've also learned something. If the foundation isn't strong, sooner or later the house will crack. I picked up a folder of papers from the small table beside me. This week I completed several changes, I said. Mark's inheritance rights to the family company and this estate have been revoked. A wave of murmurs spread through the crowd. Those assets, I continued, have been transferred to a charitable foundation that supports elderly widows in this region. I looked down at Mark. He stood completely still, as if he hadn't fully understood what he had just heard. Mark, I said calmly, you and your wife have 24 hours to leave this estate. No one applauded. No one spoke. Under the warm yellow lights of that Savannah garden, only one thing had become perfectly clear. The perfect celebration everyone believed they were attending had just ended in a very different way. For a few seconds after I finished speaking, the garden was almost completely silent. I stood on the stage, the microphone still in my hand, but I didn't say anything else. There was no need. Everything that needed to be said had already been said. A soft breeze moved through the old oak trees above us. The strings of yellow lights swayed, gently casting quiet streaks of light across the grass. I looked down. Mark was still standing in the same place. The confidence that had been on his face earlier was gone. He looked up at the screen, then over at Olivia. Olivia was no longer smiling. In the 6 months I had known her, I had never seen that expression before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't panic. It was calculation. The quick kind that happens when a plan suddenly collapses. Mr. Bates stepped forward. Henry, he said, trying to keep his voice calm. There must be some kind of misunderstanding. I placed the microphone on the table. There's no misunderstanding, I said. I didn't raise my voice, but in the quiet garden it carried clearly. The documents I mentioned were confirmed by my lawyer this morning. Mr. Bates opened his mouth as if to argue further, but then stopped when he noticed the expressions of several guests nearby. The people who had known me for years in Savannah were not the kind who enjoyed watching a loud public dispute. Mark finally walked closer to the stage. Dad, he said, just one word, but his voice sounded very different from the afternoon before in the dressing room. I stepped down from the stage. Only a few steps separated us now. You can't do this here, Mark said quietly, but clearly enough for me to hear, in front of everyone. I looked at him for a moment. How do you think your mother felt these past 6 months? I asked. Mark didn't answer. I didn't say it to embarrass him. It was simply a question he needed to hear, sooner or later. Olivia stepped beside him. "Henry," she said, trying to maintain her familiar composure. "We can talk about this privately." "We already have," I replied. I looked directly at her. "You just didn't realize you were speaking in front of a camera." For the first time that evening, Olivia had no immediate response. A few guests quietly began leaving. Small conversations slowly returned in distant corners of the garden. The party continued in its own way, but it was clearly no longer the same. Mark stood still for a few seconds. Then, unexpectedly, he lowered his head. "Dad," he said softly, "I was wrong. I heard the words, but they didn't change much inside me. Perhaps because they had come too late. Everything went too far," Mark continued. I nodded. "Yes," I said. We stood there in silence for a moment. Then I placed my hand on his shoulder. Not as immediate forgiveness, only as a sign that this conversation didn't need to continue in front of everyone. "You can come see me tomorrow," I said. "Alone." Mark nodded slowly. I left the garden after that. By the time I drove home, Savannah had grown quiet. The familiar stone streets reflected the pale yellow glow of streetlights. Carol was still awake when I walked into the house. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of warm tea. "How was the party?" she asked. I hung my coat on the chair and sat down across from her. "I think people will remember that evening for quite a long time," I said. Carol studied me for a moment, as if reading the parts of the story I hadn't yet told out loud. "You did what you needed to do," she said gently. I nodded. We sat quietly for a while. Outside the window, the ocean breeze from the Savannah River drifted through the neighborhood. After so many years of constant work, this house had always been the only place where life seemed to slow down. "Do you regret it?" Carol asked. I thought for a few seconds before answering. "No," I said, "but I'm not happy about it either." Carol gave a small smile. "I understand." A week later, small news reports began appearing in the local papers about debts connected to Mr. Bates's old campaign. A financial investigation opened, and that family quickly disappeared from the social gatherings in Savannah. Mark left the estate just as I had asked. He came to see me once afterward. Our conversation wasn't long, but it was enough for him to understand that trust cannot be rebuilt with only a few apologies. Still, I told him one thing. "You can still build your life again," I said. "But this time, you'll have to build it yourself." Months passed. One early spring morning, Carol and I drove our old convertible out of Savannah. We headed toward the coast. The seaside road stretched ahead of us, the wind carrying the smell of salt and the distant sound of waves. Carol tied her silk scarf tighter around her neck as the wind grew stronger. "Do you remember the last time we took a trip like this?" she asked. "I think more than 20 years ago," I said. Carol laughed softly. "That's a long time." I looked at the road ahead. There are things in life people call a legacy houses companies' wealth. But after everything that had happened, I realized something simpler. A true legacy isn't what you leave behind for others. It's how you live, and how you protect the people who truly deserve to stand beside you. Carol placed her hand on mine as the car continued along the coastline, and for the first time in many months, I felt something I had almost forgotten. Relief. "Thank you for staying with me through this story to the very end. At this stage of life, I understand that some of the most important lessons don't come from winning, but from having the courage to stand up and protect what is right." If this story made you think or reminded you of something important in your own life, that truly means a lot to me. Please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who might need to hear it. Your support helps me continue telling more stories like this. Slow, honest stories, worth reflecting on.